We feel secure in our community, trusting our neighbors are going to watch our backs when things get tough. Whether it's a next-door neighbor or a neighboring community, it's common to assume that the people we live close to have our best interests at heart. Because of that, we grow comfortable with the people who live around us and let our guards down. Sometimes, though, those people are the ones we need protection from. "37-year-old Royal Emerson Whitman took over command of Camp Grant in early 1871, in an area formerly home to the Aravaipa Apaches before they were driven out by American settlers. Whitman had a lengthy military career, moving his way from Sergeant Major of the 23rd Maine Volunteer Infantry to captain in 1863. Following his voluntary service, Whitman rejoined and was later appointed as lieutenant colonel. In mid-1867, he joined the U.S. Cavalry, receiving a braver rank of first lieutenant for his service in the Battle of Sabine Crossroads. The camp was situated in Arizona, 50 miles from Tucson. One day in February, 5 elderly Apache women stumbled into Camp Grant searching for one of their sons who had been taken prisoner. Unlike many at the time, Whitman had no desire for conflict. Instead, he made sure the women were fed and treated well. Soon, the news spread of the option to settle at Camp Grant, and other Apaches from various areas began arriving where they received much-needed beef and flour rations. Seeing the increase in demand, Whitman created a refugee camp along Aravaipa Creek, about 5 miles from Camp Grant. 500 Aravaipa and Pinal Apaches lived here, including Chief Escaminzim. The relationship between the Apaches and Camp Grant was mutually beneficial. They would gather hay for the horses and help harvest barley in neighboring ranchers' fields. As part of their deal, Whitman had the Apache groups agree they would not participate in any raids and hand over their weapons. In retrospect, this was a decision that later left them completely defenseless. It seems that before long, Whitman started hearing whispers of unrest on the horizon, which sparked him to urge the chief to move his people to a different location. The chief refused. As Pinal and Aravaipa Apache numbers increased in the Camp Grant area, raids had continued across Arizona. In the span from March 7th to March 29th, 19 settlers had been killed in the raids and a number of livestock driven off of ranchers' lands. Despite a number of the raids taking place a long distance from Camp Grant, the growing number of Native Americans taking residence in the area became a target for the community's frustrations. Mass meetings were held in Tucson where a number of solutions were discussed. Despite multiple options, in the end, they landed on possibly the worst one of all. Throughout the winter and spring months, a vigilante group was formed by William S. Oury and Jesus Maria Elias. The so-called Committee of Public Safety believed that the Camp Grant Apaches were solely responsible for the raids taking place across southern Arizona. Their final straw came after a group of Apaches ran off some livestock from San Javier Farm on April 10th, and a handful of settlers were killed in the process. The move saw Elias contact a man named Francisco Galarrita. He was an old friend and a leader of the Tohono O'odham tribe at San Javier. In the meantime, Oury began gathering weapons and ammunition. In mid-afternoon on April 28, 1871, 146 men marched on Aravaipa Canyon. The group was made up of 6 Anglo-Americans, one of which was William Oury, 48 Mexican-Americans, and 92 members of the Tohono O'odham tribe. They reached their target at dawn on Sunday the 30th and began surrounding the Apache camp. The Tohono O'odham's job was to inflict maximum damage, while the Americans and Mexicans were tasked with taking down any fleeing Apaches. Most of the casualties were women, children, and the elderly, as many men were off hunting when the attack occurred. 144 Aravaipa and Pinals lost their lives that day before their bodies were mutilated, nearly all of which were scalped. The Mexicans and the Tohono O'odham rounded up the remaining 29 children and sold them into slavery in Mexico. When Whitman discovered the atrocity, he began searching the bodies for survivors. He only found one. He then focused on burying the bodies of the deceased and sent men out to find the Apache men who were hunting and tell them that the Camp Grant soldiers were not responsible for what had happened that day. In the evening of May 1st, the remaining Aravaipa members returned to Camp Grant. Many settlers living across southern Arizona saw no problem with what Ari, Elias, and Galarita had done, viewing the attack as necessary, but others disagreed. In early May, a local businessman sent a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. It read, quote, "The Indians at the time of the massacre being so taken by surprise and considering themselves perfectly safe with scarcely any arms, those that could get away ran for the mountains." The key word from that letter was the word massacre, as no other people or publications had used this word up until that point. Soon, the military and various press agencies were referring to the event by the same word, and they were correct, because it had been a massacre. When President Ulysses S. Grant heard of what the vigilantes had done, he sent word to the governor of Arizona that if the men responsible were not tried for their deeds, Arizona would be placed under martial law. It took some time to round them up, but in October of 1871, a Tucson grand jury indicted 100 men involved in the attack with 108 counts of murder. The trial began around 2 months later. Unsurprisingly, considering the location in which the trial took place, the jury announced a verdict of not guilty following just 19 minutes of deliberation. The defense had spoken solely about the recent Apache raids and settler killings. They had no interest in focusing on the innocent lives that were taken. When news of the verdict spread to southern Arizona Apache groups, many left their lands and started finding new, safer areas to live in. Settlers slowly took their places, and the Apaches were never able to regain control of their ancestral lands of the San Pedro River Valley. Royal Emerson Whitman left the Army 8 years later in 1879. He moved to Washington, where he married Mary Miller Blood in 1902. He died at the age of 79 at his home and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Following the Camp Grant massacre, then Arizona Commanding Officer Colonel Stoneman was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel George Crook in May of 1871. Crook reviewed military posts like Camp Grant across Arizona and possible sites for Indian reservations. A year after he was placed in charge, Crook ordered that a new Fort Grant be set up at Mount Graham, seeing Camp Grant closed down. In March of 1873, the last of the military personnel cleared out of Camp Grant, leaving it abandoned. All these years later, Central Arizona College's Aravaipa campus now sits in its place. Following the massacre, a Camp Grant reservation was created for the remaining Apache. A year later, it was moved in an effort to consolidate the existing reservations. Today, the site of the Camp Grant massacre remains unmarked, leaving this tragedy in American history largely unknown. Just remember that the people who live near you might not be the people who you think they are. They may welcome you with open arms, but once you're past the threshold, they'll stab you in the back. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.